In the darkness and despair of war, a light is shining in Gaza. A former terrorist who turned to Christ reports that Gaza's Christians are serving their community. And Jesus is appearing to people in dreams and visions. Gary Lane has the story.
Amid tragedy and suffering, God is intervening in war-torn Gaza.
About 200 Gazans gave their heart to Jesus in one lump sum because the Lord appeared to them in visions and dreams, and they were hugging each other and rejoicing, and realized that all of them had the same vision that each one of them had.
In Gaza, a land that has long been known for its wars, blockades, and endless suffering, something has taken place that no news outlet, no politician, and no government could have ever predicted. In a place many have written off as hopeless, thousands of voices are suddenly rising with the same astonishing claim: they have seen Jesus. At first, it sounded like a rumor, the kind of story people pass quietly to one another in the shadows, too afraid to say it aloud, too afraid it might not be real. But the whispers grew louder, the stories multiplied, and soon the world's attention turned to this strip of land not because of rockets or conflict, but because of testimonies of the miraculous. Imagine for a moment waking up in one of the most war-torn corners of the earth, expecting only despair, and instead finding that a light stronger than darkness had broken in. That is exactly what thousands in Gaza insist has happened, and their voices are too many to ignore. For generations, Gaza has been marked by turmoil. Ancient armies marched across its soil, kingdoms clashed at its gates, and prophets once cried out against its idols. This narrow strip of land has been caught in the struggle of empires, from the Philistines of old to the Romans, and now modern powers locked in endless conflict. Families have been raised under the constant sound of airstrikes. Children have grown up never knowing a life free from fear, and generations have carried trauma that seems to pass like an inheritance. Yet history has always shown that it is often in the darkest valleys where light chooses to shine brightest. Gaza today is a place of deep wounds and division, but it is also a place where faith runs strong. Islam dominates nearly every aspect of life here, while a small, often overlooked Christian community quietly persists in the background. To outsiders, it looks like nothing will ever change, that the cycle of war and grief will continue forever. But in the midst of hopelessness, something entirely unexpected has erupted, something that is rewriting the story of this land. Thousands are saying that the Messiah himself has stepped into their nightmares with visions of peace and words of love, and for the first time in their lives, they are beginning to believe that change is possible. This is not the story of politics or armies. This is the story of Gaza as a stage for the unthinkable, a place of pain suddenly becoming the backdrop of a miracle. It all began quietly, almost like a rumor carried on the wind, fragile enough to be dismissed, but persistent enough to stir curiosity. A father whispered to his neighbor that his daughter had woken in the middle of the night, trembling, describing a man clothed in dazzling white who told her not to be afraid. A mother insisted that her young son, barely old enough to speak clearly, kept pointing upward and repeating, "The man from heaven came." At first, these were isolated stories, scattered across neighborhoods and villages, the kind of strange events people brushed aside as imagination or stress brought on by constant war. But soon another family claimed the same thing, then another, until the number of witnesses was too great to dismiss. These were not random, disconnected accounts. They were eerily identical, filled with details too precise to ignore. A man with eyes like fire, a robe shining brighter than the sun, a voice that carried both power and tenderness, and one name spoken over and over again: Isa al-Masih, Jesus, the Messiah. The stories began to spread rapidly, not through newspapers or television, but through conversations whispered late at night when the streets grew quiet. Families that had never spoken to each other about faith suddenly found themselves gathering in secret, comparing what they had seen, their voices shaking with awe. it became clear that something beyond imagination was unfolding. Some described seeing this radiant figure walking through the rubble of destroyed homes, his presence filling the broken places with peace. Others claimed that while they lay sick or injured, he appeared, touched them, and they were healed instantly. Mothers testified that their children awoke crying tears of joy, pointing to corners of their rooms and insisting they had seen the man in white smiling at them. Each testimony added another piece to the puzzle, and what once seemed impossible began to take on the weight of reality. Skeptics tried to explain it away as dreams caused by trauma, hallucinations from sleepless nights, or the influence of imagination, but the consistency was overwhelming. Thousands of people, many from different walks of life, reported the same vision down to the smallest detail. The figure was always clothed in brilliant white. His presence always brought an indescribable calm, and his words always carried the same message of love, peace, and forgiveness. Some said when he spoke, the very ground seemed to vibrate, yet they felt no fear. Instead, they were filled with a hope they had never known before. What stunned people most was not just the vision itself, but the way it transformed those who saw it. Men known for anger and violence suddenly became gentle. Women who had carried bitterness for years were suddenly radiant with joy. Even those who had been hostile to anything Christian found themselves unable to deny what they had experienced. As the testimonies multiplied, a pattern emerged that shook the community to its core. These encounters were not limited to one family or one street. They spread across neighborhoods, across towns, even across the entire strip of land. It was as if a wave had swept over Gaza, leaving behind story after story of encounters with the same figure. And though each person described their experience in their own words, the essence was always the same. Jesus had appeared to them, bringing light into their darkness. This was not the work of missionaries, nor the product of propaganda. It was spontaneous, unexpected, and uncontainable. What began as whispers of the divine quickly erupted into something far greater, something that could no longer be ignored. The shift from whispers to a movement came faster than anyone could have imagined. What started as secret conversations between neighbors soon broke into public declarations. Families who had once hidden their stories in fear began stepping forward boldly, unwilling to stay silent about what they had seen. One by one, testimonies were shared not just within homes, but in markets, in schools, even in the streets. At first, people were cautious, wondering if they were alone in their experiences. But as voices joined together, the realization dawned that thousands were seeing the same thing. Entire gatherings formed, not led by any official leader, but drawn together by a shared encounter that defied explanation. It was not simply a movement of belief, it was a movement of transformation. Anger gave way to forgiveness. Division gave way to unity. In a place long known for violence and bitterness, people were embracing one another with tears of joy, confessing that they too had seen the Messiah. Former religious leaders, once fierce defenders of tradition, began standing before their communities and declaring without hesitation, "We have seen him. We have met the one who is alive." These were not words spoken lightly. To proclaim such things in Gaza was to invite risk, to invite ridicule, even to invite danger. And yet, they spoke with a courage that could only come from certainty. Within weeks, the number of those confessing faith had exploded. It was no longer a handful of testimonies scattered here and there. It was a flood of voices rising together. Reports came in that entire households were turning to Christ in a single night. Men who had spent their lives consumed by hatred confessed to being undone by a single vision of Jesus. Their hearts so overwhelmed that they could no longer live as they once had. Women who had carried grief for decades found their sorrow lifted, replaced by a peace that no war could shatter. The movement spread across towns and neighborhoods until it was undeniable that something remarkable was unfolding. Even those who refused to believe the visions could not ignore the visible change in the people who claimed to have seen them. Faces once marked by hopelessness now radiated joy. Communities long divided by conflict now gathered in unity. The shift was so dramatic that it began to be described as a revival unlike anything seen in generations. What made this moment so powerful was the sheer scale and speed of it all. Conversions did not come through persuasion or debate, nor were they the result of missionaries or foreign influence. They came from direct personal encounters with the risen Christ. One man told of seeing Jesus in his dream for 3 nights in a row, and by the 3rd night, he surrendered his life completely. Another woman described how her sickness vanished after a single touch in her vision, convincing her that he was not just a prophet, but the living Son of God. These were not isolated stories. They were multiplied thousands of times across the region. And as more and more people stepped forward, fear was replaced with boldness. Those who once worshipped in secret now gathered openly, singing and praying together, proclaiming their new faith without hesitation. The revival could not be silenced. It spread from home to home, street to street, until the land itself seemed to echo with the testimonies of those who declared that they had met the Messiah. This was not a quiet change, not something hidden in the shadows. It was loud, visible, unstoppable. Where despair had reigned, joy now erupted. Where hopelessness had defined generations, hope now burned brighter than ever before. The entire atmosphere shifted as if a spiritual earthquake had shaken Gaza to its core. People who had never thought freedom was possible suddenly believed. Families broken by years of conflict found reconciliation. Even enemies were embracing each other, united by a shared conviction that Jesus had appeared to them. In the heart of one of the world's most war-torn regions, a miracle was unfolding, a revival born not of human effort, but of divine encounter. And as the movement gained momentum, it became clear that nothing would ever be the same again. The stories that began to pour out of Gaza carried with them a weight that was impossible to dismiss. These were not vague accounts or half-remembered dreams. They were detailed testimonies delivered with trembling voices and tear-filled eyes. A woman spoke of how she had been bedridden for years, plagued with pain that no doctor could heal. One night she saw a man clothed in brilliant light standing in her home, though every door and window was locked. He looked at her with compassion and simply said, "Do not be afraid. I am with you." In that instant, the pain that had crippled her for so long vanished. She rose from her bed, strength coursing through her body, and from that day forward she declared to all who would listen that Jesus had healed her. A young man who once led chants against Christians broke down weeping as he explained how night after night he dreamed of the same figure. On the 3rd night, the figure drew near and said, "I died for you." He awoke, trembling, overwhelmed by a love he could not resist, and gave his life to Christ. Another man described how in his vision, Jesus placed his hand on his shoulder and whispered, "You are forgiven." He had lived burdened by guilt from choices made in the chaos of war, but in that moment, he felt free, lighter than air. Stories like these rippled through the community, and even those who had not seen Jesus themselves could not deny the transformation in those who claimed they had. What gave these testimonies such power was not just the miraculous encounters, but the undeniable change in people's lives. Men known for violence softened overnight, their rage replaced by peace. Women who carried bitterness for decades now spoke words of forgiveness. Families that had been shattered by anger found themselves gathering again in unity. Even skeptics who at first dismissed the stories began to wrestle with the reality of what they saw before them. Neighbors who once lived in despair now radiating joy. It was not just 1 or 2 lives touched, but thousands, each adding their voice to a chorus of transformation that grew louder with every passing day. Those who heard these testimonies were left with only 2 choices: either dismiss them as impossible or admit that something beyond human understanding was unfolding in Gaza. As the testimonies spread across the world, a larger question began to rise, a question that shook both believers and skeptics alike. Could this be the fulfillment of ancient prophecy? The scriptures speak of a day when the Spirit of God will be poured out on all people. when dreams and visions will flood the earth, and when nations will see the glory of God in ways they never expected. The prophet Joel declared that sons and daughters would prophesy, that old men would dream dreams, and young men would see visions. Revelation paints the picture of a great multitude from every tribe and nation standing before the throne of the Lamb, worshipping together as one. For centuries, believers have wondered when and how such prophecies would unfold. Few would have dared to imagine that a place like Gaza, scarred by war and overshadowed by despair, could become the setting for such a mighty move of God. And yet, the sheer scale of what was happening forced people to consider it. Could this wave of visions and mass conversions be more than coincidence? Could it be a glimpse of that great harvest spoken of in Scripture? The thought itself was enough to send shockwaves through Christian communities around the globe. Pastors preached with renewed urgency, missionaries looked on with awe, and ordinary believers began to ask if they were witnessing history being made. Some wondered aloud if the Spirit of God was preparing the world for something greater, using Gaza as the first spark of a flame that could spread across nations. Others asked if these events were a sign of the times, a foretaste of the day when every knee shall bow and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord. Debate raged, but one truth stood firm. The testimonies were real, the transformation undeniable, and the impact impossible to measure. Whether prophecy fulfilled or not, the events in Gaza forced the world to look again at Scripture and ask with fresh eyes if we were seeing the hand of God moving in our own time. And for those who had encountered Jesus personally, there was no debate, no question, no hesitation. They knew with absolute certainty that the Messiah had come to them, and nothing would ever be the same again. The world could not remain indifferent once the reports from Gaza spread beyond its borders. Governments were caught off guard, unsure how to interpret what was unfolding. For some, the sudden rise of Christianity in one of the most politically sensitive and religiously intense regions of the world posed a potential threat to stability. Leaders feared unrest, backlash, and new waves of conflict born not from political lines but from spiritual awakening. Others dismissed the testimonies outright, calling them exaggerations or illusions fueled by desperation. Yet no matter how much some tried to explain it away, the sheer number of eyewitness accounts and the undeniable transformation in the lives of those affected made it impossible to ignore. Religious leaders around the globe entered into fierce debate. Some Muslim clerics denounced the claims as lies meant to weaken Islam, while others quietly admitted that something was happening, which they could not fully explain. Among Christians, reactions were equally intense. Some saw it as the beginning of one of the greatest revivals since the Book of Acts, while others cautioned against getting swept up in sensationalism. Media outlets struggled to cover the story without revealing their bias, torn between skepticism and the temptation to broadcast a miracle. Yet whether portrayed as divine intervention or dismissed as fantasy, the result was the same. The entire world was talking about Gaza, not for its war or politics, but for thousands declaring they had seen Jesus. In the midst of all the noise, one thing remained unshakable: the testimonies themselves. They poured in relentlessly, spreading faster than officials or skeptics could suppress them. Families stood united in their witness. Former enemies embraced one another as brothers and sisters in faith. Children spoke with disarming simplicity about visions of a man in white who told them they were loved. These voices could not be silenced, for they spoke with the authority of lives forever changed. And as the world debated, the revival in Gaza continued to grow. What stunned many was not just the conversions, but the atmosphere of hope that began to cover a place long defined by despair. In a region where people had grown accustomed to suffering, suddenly joy and peace began to ripple outward. Even those who had not personally experienced a vision admitted that something extraordinary was happening all around them. What makes this story so profound is not only its miraculous nature, but where it happened. Gaza has for decades symbolized hopelessness to the outside world. Generations have looked at it as a place beyond repair, a land broken beyond healing. And yet, it was here that light began to shine in the darkest of places. The message resounding from Gaza was clear. No place is too broken for God, no people too lost for redemption, no land too scarred for healing. The transformation became a living testimony to the words of Scripture, that where sin and despair abound, grace abounds even more. If light could break through in Gaza, then it could break through anywhere. If thousands could encounter Jesus in the midst of rubble and ruin, then there is no corner of the earth beyond the reach of his love. The conclusion of this unfolding miracle leaves the world with a question that cannot be easily dismissed. What if it is all true? What if the Messiah is still appearing, still calling people to himself, still healing the broken in the most unlikely of places? For those who lived through it, there is no question. They know what they saw, they know who they met, and they will never be the same again. The testimonies stand as living proof that in the darkest moments, when humanity believes hope is gone, God can break through with light that no war, no ideology, no barrier can overcome. The world may debate, governments may resist, and skeptics may doubt. But the people of Gaza who encountered Jesus carry a certainty that cannot be shaken. Their lives shine as evidence that something greater than politics, greater than war, greater than human explanation has touched their land. And as their voices continue to echo, the message becomes clear. If such a miracle could happen here, then truly there is no limit to what God can do. The story of Gaza is not just about thousands converted. It is about a world being reminded that hope is alive, that Jesus is still moving, and that light will always overcome the darkness.